Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Mark Rutte, novi generalni sekretar NATO-a, kazao je ono što su mnogi Evropljani poricali. Vrijeme je da se prijeđe na ratni način razmišljanja. Zapadne vojne i obavještajne agencije sada vide eskalirajuću kampanju hibridnih napada Kremlja sa ciljem destabilizacije Evrope. Oni uključuju sabotažu zračnog prometa i ometanje GPS signala, nadlijetanje dronova preko kritične infrastrukture, širenje dezinformacija i miješanje u izbore u Rumuniji i Moldaviji. Sa Ukrajinom u defanzivnom položaju, dok Rusija napreduje na bojnom polju, predsjednik Donald Trump i njegovi savjetnici nagovijestili su da bi predsjednik Rusije Vladimir Putin mogao da zadrži kontrolu nad skoro 20% ukrajinske teritorije koju njegove snage kontrolišu. Čak i ako se Putinova invazija na Ukrajinu uskoro okonča, Evropa će se suočiti sa neprijateljski nastrojenom Rusijom, čiju u bitkama prekaljenu vojsku podupire ratna ekonomija koja izbacuje ogromne količine naoružanja. Neki dužnosnici strahuju od izravnog vojnog sukoba i brinu se da će Evropa ostati izložena ako američke sigurnosne garancije unutar NATO-a oslabe pod budućim predsjednikom Donaldom Trumpom. Ambassador John Bolton, former national security advisor to President Donald Trump. Hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us now. Let me start by asking you, many people here in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe more generally are very anxious regarding Russia's aggression on Ukraine and what might change when President-elect Donald Trump takes over in a few weeks. He has said that he will end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. But as we look at the question of endgame in Ukraine, do you see a formula that would be acceptable to the Ukrainians and also plausible given where things stand on the battlefield at this moment? And do you see any willingness on Putin's part to enter into a serious negotiation at this moment?
Well, I don't see what the shape of a final deal would be that would be acceptable to Ukraine or to Russia. And in fact, even Trump himself has conceded that it may take a little bit longer than 48 hours. Of course, 24 hours. He said that after the election, safely for him. But I think Trump's attitude on Ukraine is very troubling. And I'm worried that his good friend in Moscow, Vladimir Putin, will convince him that Russia's position is better than Ukraine's position. So this is going to take a lot of consultation, deliberation between the U.S. and its European allies in NATO. It's not inevitable that Ukraine's going to get a bad deal out of this, but given what I think is Trump's real interest here is to get this war off his table. He views it as Biden's war. He said if he had been president, the war never would have happened. Of course, that statement's neither provable nor disprovable, but he wants the war behind him, and that means he doesn't care what the terms are on which the war is ended. So that that makes me pessimistic about the outcome from Ukraine's point of view.
Right. So if he's looking for a one-off deal with Vladimir Putin, will that send a very wrong message to American allies in Europe?
Well, I think it would. I think it would be very discouraging, and I'm worried as well that the discussion about what to do next in Ukraine ties into Trump's frequently commented desire to withdraw from NATO itself. So the two could be very closely linked. I think it's Trump's statements that he wants to withdraw from NATO reflect his true beliefs. He may be distracted from doing that for 4 years, but I think we're in a very, very dangerous position on NATO.
Do you think President-elect Trump will take over where he stopped 4 years ago, or will he start from zero?
No, I think a lot of his views will be exactly where he left off when he left office on January the 20th, 2021. Obviously, the world situation is very different, but he views Ukraine really as the place that led to his first impeachment. And he's saying warm things in the aftermath of the election because it's easier to do that than to say exactly what he's going to do. But I wouldn't take whatever he's saying in the transition period to be definitive. What he has said publicly, what he's communicated his views are, people should take those statements seriously.
Right, sir. And now at this stage, what do you think Vladimir Putin is fighting for? Is he trying to keep the land that he has already captured? Is he trying to hoping to capture more land, or was it something else entirely?
Well, I think at the moment on the battlefield, Putin wants to get Ukrainian troops out of Russia entirely, hopefully from his perspective, before any negotiations begin. Certainly at an absolute minimum, he'll say whatever territory inside Ukraine Russia now holds, that should be the de facto ceasefire line and really will become the new Ukraine-Russia border. And he won't accept anything that looks like a path for Ukraine to get into NATO, which of course is exactly what President Zelensky wants. So, negotiations haven't begun, so you don't know who's really willing to compromise.
Right.
At this point, the lines between Kyiv and Moscow don't intersect at all.
Right. Now, a number of NATO officers that I recently spoke to actually believe that Moscow might try and probe NATO's reaction with certain limited military operations in the Baltics, especially through or near the Suwalki corridor. Can Europe face up to its security challenges without U.S. support?
Well, I think if the U.S. withdrew from NATO, NATO would collapse, and Europe as a whole would be left in a very undesirable position. I think Putin in the next months may undertake provocative actions, whether against the Baltics or others, to show that he's bargaining from a position of strength. But I think it's very unlikely that he would actually cross a NATO border because that would require a response, and even Trump might have to go along with it. I think if the Ukraine war were settled to Russia's satisfaction, they would turn their attention in the short term to other non-NATO former parts of the Soviet Union, like Moldova, which I worry about quite a bit, and the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan.
Right. Now, let me ask about Syria. I remember from your previous interviews when Bashar al-Assad first used chemical weapons, you wanted the U.S. to respond and to respond forcefully, sort of to establish a deterrent. But there was obstruction, so to speak, from the DOD as far as I remember. Then reactions did come somewhat belatedly. Now that Assad is ousted, the new Syrian government has certain Islamist roots. How should the U.S. approach a country run by a group that it has designated as terrorist?
Well, I think we've got to be very careful. I mean, the HTS leadership is trying to say that they're no longer an ISIS spinoff. They're no longer terrorists. I don't think the evidence is there for that proposition. But one way to test it is to ask for performance from HTS, from the new leadership in Damascus. For example, we want immediate and unconditional access to all Syrian government chemical weapons and biological weapons programs. We want OPCW inspectors on the chemical side. We can find others on the biological weapon side. That's one point. Second point is we want immediate release of all American hostages and frankly, all hostages from the Assad regime, or we want confirmation if this is the sad reality that they've died. This new regime has no stake in continuing to hold any foreign hostages, and I think that's a tangible sign that maybe they're not terrorists anymore. And I think we need indications from them that they're not totally under the control of Turkey, and that their aspirations really go only to a civil kind of government in Syria. I'm very worried about the Turkish position in northern Syria. I'm worried on behalf of the Kurds, particularly in northeastern Syria. So it's the bulk of the spotlight should be on HTS, but I think we also need to turn the spotlight up on Turkey, because if they are serious about taking Syrian territory, whether through affiliated militia or through direct Turkish military involvement, it's going to make an already dangerous, complicated situation much worse.
Right. Now, do you see the fall of Assad as being directly correlated to Israel's campaign of assassinations against high-ranking Hezbollah members and bringing Iran onto its back foot?
Well, I think Iran has certainly suffered enormous setbacks. I think Israel nearly dismembering Hamas and really pummeling Hezbollah, although that job isn't finished yet, probably led HTS and Turkey in some kind of combination to think they had an opportunity to move against Assad, which they obviously did. I think everybody is surprised at how rapidly Assad fell, beginning with Assad, but it's a third major defeat for Iran in the region since the Ring of Fire strategy against Israel was launched on October the 7th. And I think Iran is very definitely now in a dangerous position. I think the regime is in trouble too, because we've had press reports that indicate that inside Iran, there's a lot of finger pointing about the regime's responsibility. And the people are saying, look, they've spent tens of billions of dollars over decades to support these terrorist proxies. That's money that could have gone to benefit the people of Iran, but it hasn't. So I think the regime's position in Tehran is significantly weaker now.
Right. You just a while ago mentioned how it's worrisome that Turkey has certain territorial pretensions and aspirations and a lot of influence in the new government of Syria, but also it's worth mentioning here that the Israeli Defense Forces have captured Mount Meron, which is roughly 40 kilometers from Damascus. How do you make sense of that?
Well, I think the Israelis are worried that there could be a new terrorist state forming on their border, and actually, what they've captured is within the zone of UN oversight. They haven't extended, at least not too far, into Syria. The Golan Heights are already 40 kilometers from Damascus. Mount Hermon is simply the tallest geographical feature in that area.
And finally, as we move towards the end of this interview, how do you make sense of the fact, I mean, going back to the US again, how do you make sense of the fact that we see Elon Musk meeting with foreign leaders at the president's side, you know, traveling with him, you know, jumping into a call with President Zelensky, going to Paris with President-elect Donald Trump? I mean, does this complicate matters in running America's foreign policy? Who is in charge exactly?
Well, it's a good question, who's in charge, especially with the breakdown of congressional negotiations over how to fund the government that we're going through at the moment. This is a transition period. Despite appearances, Trump's not president yet. He won't be until the 20th of January. And at that point, I think Musk's role will change. I'd be surprised if it didn't. I don't know of any parallel to the influence that he's had, except maybe in 2016, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, had considerable influence. But it's unlikely, I guess I would say, that relationship will continue as it is now once the president-elect is inaugurated.
Right. Ambassador Bolton, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Detaljnije o nedostatku reakcija stručnjaka za međunarodno pravo i eksperata za ljudska prava dok traje genocid u Gazi razgovaramo sa britanskim advokatom Tobyjem Cadmanom. Toby, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us now. First of all, let's talk about the genocide taking place in Gaza. I was taught in law school, you know, that international law is a rather strict form of legal regulation that applies to all, regardless of their military and political might. We were taught that, you know, states will abide and are obliged to abide by international treaties and conventions that they sign. And now, when you look at how Israel is demolishing Gaza and effectively annihilating the Palestinians as a nation, you know, it seems that all the belief in all these norms seems like a fallacy, you know. So what exactly happened to international law?
Thank you. I think that certainly from my perspective, what we've seen is that Israel is not just demolishing Gaza and dehumanizing the Palestinian people, it is also destroying international law and our understanding of international law. If we look at, for example, what the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, said, he said that in order for the law to be effective, it has to apply to all equally. We then have statements from French government officials that make the comment that the ICC was not set up to deal with countries such as Israel, and that sends a very, very dangerous message as to the universal application of international law and specifically international humanitarian law. I think certainly one of the comments that I've made ever since the genocide started was that how we deal with this particular crisis will determine how international law is applied in the future. And what we've got to think about is as devastating as the situation is right now, and what we've seen in Gaza certainly over the last few months, is what if we do nothing now, what is the next conflict going to look like? How much further is this going to be pushed? I mean, already we see it going into Lebanon, into Syria, and more recently into Yemen.
Crossing all red lines.
Crossing all red lines, and it seems as though, and I hate to be the one to keep saying it, but I will keep saying it, is that if this was happening anywhere else in the world, we would not be having this discussion. When we look at Israel, the victim status that they hold on to, and that any form of criticism of what they do is labelled as anti-Semitism.
Why is it so? I mean, are we talking here simply, are Muslim lives seen as being less value compared to European white Caucasian lives? Is it about anti-Palestinian racism? Is it about Islamophobia, which is entrenched in the minds of certain Western politicians, if you will?
Well, we only have to look at the parallel situations in Ukraine and Palestine, where we can see exactly the same type of crimes being committed. We see hospitals being targeted, we see children being murdered, and we see the response of the international community in response to that as compared to their response to the situation in Palestine. You know, we refer to the right of self-defense. Well, the right of self-defense, as many international scholars have said, does not apply to an occupying power over the people that they are occupying. So there is a real problem when we look at how this is addressed. Now, I don't know if it's as simple as saying it's Islamophobia, but it's certainly a dehumanization of the Palestinian people. When we look at the language that Israeli leaders use, they use the same kind of language to describe Palestinians as what we saw the Hutus describing in the Rwandan genocide to the Tutsis. So, you know, in Palestine they refer to them as human animals. And in Rwanda, they refer to them as cockroaches. Right. You know, you have to ask yourself, where is the difference? But I think one of the most defining moments for me, as to when we see that there is a very, very different approach to white Europeans, as opposed to Middle East, whether we're talking about Syria, Palestine, or Yemen. So I remember the moment I was traveling from London to Rotterdam. I was doing a trial at the Kosovo Specialist Chambers in The Hague, and so I was taking the Eurostar back at the end of every week. And I remember the first time I saw the mass of people outside the terminal holding the blue and yellow flags of Ukraine, offering their help to those that had fled Ukraine. Now, I don't remember seeing them holding Syrian revolution flags. I don't remember seeing them holding Palestinian flags. So there is this different approach when, you know, when we look at different situations. It is almost as though the lives of Palestinians, in their eyes, matters less than those that are effectively closer to home and white European.
Right. Before we wrap up, let me ask you about Syria. You know, a lot of crimes carried out by the Ba'ath Party regime have been documented by activists, by opposition fighters, but also by Assad's very own fighters. We have already seen a number of trials against a handful of officials and security intelligence operatives of the Assad regime in various European and I believe in various European courts, mostly in Germany. Now, how do you envision transitional justice in Syria? Do you see it necessary to establish an ad hoc UN tribunal like the ones we saw in the case of former Yugoslavia or in Rwanda? Will it take time for Syria to develop its own independent judiciary? Yeah, what challenges would you expect this country, the new government of Syria, to face over the coming months and years?
So I've been involved with the situation in Syria since the revolution started, and I've spent a great deal of time with a number of human rights activists, lawyers, defected judges, and you know, the one discussion that we always had was, and again, none of us saw this happening none of us saw Assad effectively falling within 12 weeks in this, what we've seen most recently. But the discussions that we always had was that if you will need to have some international process to deal with those at the very, very top of the chain of command. But the majority of the work will be done by Syrians. And so a lot of the work that has been done, sort of training them and preparing them. And it's interesting when you have discussions, and I mean, I can go back as far back as 2012, 2013, when I was involved with working with some of the defected judges and lawyers and police chiefs, was that they'd never really experienced a system which they could call an independent judicial system. And it was. I remember there's a very famous Syrian filmmaker called Wad Al-Khatib. She did this documentary. She did this documentary for Sama, and so at Guernica we have this podcast which is all about accountability, and we ask every guest, what does justice mean to you, and what does accountability mean to you? And so everyone gives a different answer, but I'll never forget her answer, which is, well, I've never seen it. I've never seen what that could look like. So it was a very difficult question for her to answer. And this is somebody who has spent, certainly the last few years, dedicating herself to the pursuit of justice and accountability. There is very little understanding as to how that should function, but there is as we can see, there is a thirst for justice and a thirst for accountability. There's not necessarily a universal thirst for revenge. Now the question is, how do you deliver that? Well, I think the days of ad hoc tribunals are over. We should have had an ad hoc tribunal for Ukraine. We should have had an ad hoc tribunal for Syria, for Yemen, for all of these situations. But the difficulty that you have post-Libya, when Libya was referred by the UN Security Council to the International Criminal Court, Russia and China took a very strong position that they would not support any more mechanisms of this kind because they considered it to be regime change.
Exactly.
And in many ways it is. So if you look at having an ad hoc tribunal for Syria, you would have to have the Security Council, the UN Security Council, ratify that. And Russia is one of the main perpetrators of crimes in Syria, so it's certainly not going to sanction its own prosecution.
Exactly.
So I think that's the situation. But you could argue that you do not need to have an ad hoc tribunal. Effectively, Syria could now, the new interim government, could ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and as with Palestine, it could refer itself to the ICC. Doesn't need to go through the Security Council. I mean, certainly that is my recommendation to the interim government, is that is something that they need to consider very carefully. But they're still going to have a system of justice, and they're going to have to start to build it from scratch, effectively. But it's going to require a long-term commitment. Look, we know just from the international commitment to Bosnia, and the fact that the Bosnian State Prosecutor's Office is still prosecuting war crimes from 92, 95. And we're now in 2024.
30 years
almost,
after the Dayton Agreement,
certainly. So, and then you look at the scale of crimes that were committed on what is now the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the types of crimes compared to the crimes that have been committed in Syria over a prolonged period of time, and you recognise that it's going to take a huge commitment of the international community, but it is so important that we see that. And certainly, apart from the Israeli incursions into the Golan Heights, you can see that the international community's commitment to Syria is far less politically driven and politically stunted than the situation in Palestine. So it is a less complicated situation. But both, if we have any real faith in justice as a notion, then both Syria and Palestine has to be given the same attention to ensure that there is a system of justice.
Right. Toby, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you very much.
Jasno je da Izrael čini ratne zločine i zločin genocida u Gazi ne u kontekstu borbe protiv terorizma, nego okupacije i namjere da uništi starosjedlačku populaciju. Namjerno uništavanje bolnica, izgladnjivanje civila, prisilno premještanje sa sjevera Gaze prema jugu i ponovo sa juga prema sjeveru i blokiranje isporuke humanitarne pomoći dio su kontinuiranog sistemskog nasilja koje Izrael čini proteklih 75 godina. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste bilo koji dio propustili, emisiju možete pregledati na našem web portalu balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.